Look at the luxury around you. The sprawling mansions, the expensive cars, the smooth roads of modern-day America. It is easy to take it all for granted. It is easy to look at a wealthy, established Black family and assume they simply walked into a life of privilege. But behind every empire, there is a hidden foundation. And sometimes, that foundation is built on blood, sweat, and tears that society chose to ignore. My name is Evelyn. Today is a warm evening in May 2026, and I am 79 years old. Tonight, my entire family is gathered in the grand dining hall of my estate. My children, who are successful corporate lawyers and doctors, and my grandchildren, who wear designer clothes and complain about slow internet connections. They are laughing, eating, and enjoying the fruits of a tree they never had to water. They think they know me. They think I am just a sweet, wealthy grandmother who likes to look out the window. They have no idea about the darkness I survived. As the laughter echoes through the room, I stand up. The room goes quiet. I walk to the closet and pull out a battered, scratched brown leather suitcase with a broken, rusted lock. It looks out of place in this multi-million-dollar room. I place it heavily on the polished mahogany dining table. "Grandma, what is that junk?" My 16-year-old grandson laughs, pointing at it. I look at him, my wise, piercing eyes freezing the smile on his face. I slide my hand over the scarred leather. "In the winter of 1965, I say, my voice trembling slightly, but filled with an undeniable power. I arrived at the New York docks. I was an 18-year-old African girl. I had no family here, no money, no home, no friends. The entire world I owned was locked inside this tiny, broken suitcase. And the America I stepped into didn't want me here." The room falls into a dead silence. My children lower their forks. For the first time in 60 years, I am unlocking the vault of my past. I am about to tell them how the people who tried to destroy me ended up watching me build the very sky they look up to. But the nightmare didn't start with success. It started with a cold, terrifying night on the streets of Harlem. When the ship docked in 1965, my heart was racing with hope. Back home in my small village, America was described as a magical land, where the streets were paved with gold, and every dream was possible. I had saved every single penny, working 16 hours a day for 3 years, just to buy a third-class ticket across the ocean. But when I stepped off that boat, the magic vanished into thin air. The air was bitterly cold, a freezing wind that bit into my thin cotton dress. But the climate wasn't the coldest thing. The eyes of the people were. This was the height of segregation and deep racial tension in America. I walked into a world divided by a cruel, invisible line. I didn't have a hotel reservation. I didn't even have a map. I walked for hours until my feet bled, holding that brown suitcase tight against my chest. Every time I asked someone for directions, they either looked through me like I was a ghost, or they spit on the ground and walked away. "Go back to where you came from," a man in a sharp wool coat hissed at me outside a diner, slamming the door in my face as the smell of warm soup drifted out. I spent my very first night in America shivering under a concrete bridge in Harlem, listening to the sirens wailing in the distance. I used my leather suitcase as a pillow, crying silently so the shadows wouldn't hear me. I was starving, my stomach twisting in pain, completely alone in a city of millions. I kept asking myself, is this the dream I sacrificed my home for? Is this the golden land? The next morning, desperate for food, I found a small bakery. The sign on the window read, "Help Wanted." I took a deep breath, straightened my dress, and walked inside. A large white man with a stained apron stood behind the counter. "Please, sir," I whispered, my voice shaking from hunger. "I can clean, I can wash, I can do anything. I just need a job." The man looked at my dark skin, then at my ragged suitcase. A cruel smirk appeared on his face. "Sure, girl, I have a job for you, but the pay is low, and you don't get to step into the front of the shop. You stay in the dark basement washing the pans." I didn't care about the basement. I just wanted to survive. I nodded eagerly, thinking this was my foot in the door. But that wasn't the worst part. I didn't know that this man was my first introduction to absolute betrayal. For the next 6 months, my life was confined to that dark, damp bakery basement. I worked 14 hours a day, scrubbing heavy, grease-covered iron trays until my fingers were raw and bleeding. The basement had no heating. In the winter, the water in my wash bucket would literally freeze around my wrists. The owner, Mr. Harrison, was a monster. He didn't view me as a human being. He viewed me as cheap, disposable labor. When the end of the first month arrived, I stood before him, waiting for my small wage so I could finally rent a tiny room instead of sleeping on the basement floor. Mr. Harrison threw a $5 bill on the table. "What is this, sir?" I asked, my voice cracking. The agreement was $40. "Take it or leave it," he scoffed, not even looking at me. "Who are you going to complain to? The police? You think they will take the word of an unregistered black girl over a tax-paying citizen? If you don't like it, get out. There are 10 others on the street who will take your place for a crust of bread." I stood there, the $5 bill shaking in my hand, a deep, burning humiliation washing over me. He knew I had no rights. He knew I had no voice. He was stealing my labor because he knew society had given him the permission to treat me like property. I walked back down to the dark basement, sat on a stack of flour sacks, and buried my face in my hands. The emotional pain was worse than the physical hunger. I felt like a ghost trapped under the earth, being consumed by the greed of a man who looked down on my existence. One night, around 2:00 a.m., I heard footsteps coming down the wooden stairs. It was Harrison. He was drunk, his eyes bloodshot. He looked at me sitting alone in the dark corner, and a terrifying look came over his face. "You think you're special, don't you?" he muttered, walking closer, blocking my only exit. "You come to my country, eating my bread. It's time you showed some real appreciation." Fear paralyzed my limbs. He reached out his heavy hand, grabbing the collar of my dress. In that exact second, a surge of adrenaline hit my veins. I didn't cry. I didn't beg. I grabbed a heavy iron baking sheet from the table and slammed it with all my strength against his shin. He roared in pain, stumbling backward into a rack of trays. I didn't waste a second. I grabbed my old leather suitcase, bolted up the stairs into the freezing night rain, and never looked back. I was homeless again, shivering in the dark alleys of New York. But as I sat in the pouring rain, watching the water wash away the flour dust from my skin, my sadness turned into a cold, unbreakable steel. I thought the worst was behind me, but I didn't know that the city had a different kind of trap waiting for me. By 1970, 5 years had passed. I had survived by moving from one temporary cleaning job to another. I lived in a tiny, shared attic room that leaked whenever it rained. But something inside me had changed. I realized that the people who exploited me didn't do it because they were strong. They did it because they thought I was ignorant. They thought because I had an African accent, I didn't have a mind. I started spending my evenings sitting under the street lamps outside the public library. In those days, Black people weren't welcomed warmly inside certain academic spaces, so I would wait until closing time and dig through the wooden crates of books the library threw out in the trash. I found discarded textbooks on accounting, economics, and business management. I taught myself how to read complex financial balance sheets by the light of a single candle in my attic. I filled old newspapers with calculations, using a stub of a pencil I found on the subway floor. One day, I got a job cleaning the offices of a small textile manufacturing company downtown. The owner was an elderly Jewish gentleman named Mr. Goldstein. Unlike the others, he didn't yell or treat me like dirt. He just watched me quietly as I wiped the desks and emptied the trash bins. One evening, I was cleaning his main office. Mr. Goldstein had left his ledger open on the desk. He had been struggling with a massive discrepancy in his inventory costs for weeks, a problem that was driving his business into bankruptcy. I looked at the numbers. My years of studying discarded accounting books under the candlelight instantly flashed in my brain. I saw the error immediately. It wasn't a mistake. His head clerk was hiding stolen inventory through double-entry manipulation. I hesitated. If I said something, they might accuse me of stealing. But if I kept quiet, this good man would lose his livelihood. I took a piece of scrap paper, wrote down the exact page numbers and the formula showing where the money was leaking, placed it inside the ledger, and left the building. The next evening, when I arrived for my cleaning shift, 2 large security guards were waiting for me at the entrance. My heart sank into my stomach. This is it, I thought, my hands shaking. They are going to frame me. They escorted me straight to Mr. Goldstein's private office. But when the door opened, I discovered the truth, and it changed my destiny forever. Mr. Goldstein was sitting at his desk, the scrap paper I wrote in his hand. The head clerk's desk outside was completely empty. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a profound shock and respect. "Evelyn," he said, his voice soft. "Did you write this?" I swallowed hard, nodding slowly. "Yes, sir. I didn't mean to touch your private things. I just saw the balance error while dusting the table." Mr. Goldstein stood up, walked over to me, and did something no white man in America had ever done. He extended his hand to me in a sign of equal respect. "You just saved my company from a thief who has been robbing me for 5 years, he said. "The police just arrested him. I hired top graduates from business schools, and none of them caught what you saw while holding a cleaning rag. Where did you study accounting, young lady?" "In the trash bins outside the library, sir," I replied quietly. A week later, I wasn't wearing a cleaning apron anymore. Mr. Goldstein appointed me as his assistant accountant. The white clerks in the office whispered behind my back, refusing to hand documents directly to my hand, leaving them on the floor for me to pick up. They hated seeing a black woman sitting at a desk with a pen instead of a broom. But I didn't care about their whispers. I used their hatred as fuel. Within 3 years, I completely reorganized the company's financial structure, saving them hundreds of thousands of dollars. By 1985, Mr. Goldstein was ready to retire. He had no heirs who wanted the business. He called me into his office one final time. "Evelyn, this country is changing, but it is still cruel to people who look like you," he said, sliding a contract across the table. "You built this company's modern success. I am selling the majority shares to you for a fraction of the cost. I know you will turn it into an empire." I looked at the contract. The girl who had slept under the Harlem Bridge 15 years ago was now the CEO of a manufacturing company in the heart of New York. I renamed the firm Vance International. Over the next 3 decades, I expanded from textiles into real estate and global logistics. Every single person who had ever closed a door on my face, every landlord who refused to rent me a room, every businessman who spit on my path, they all watched from the sidelines as my corporate logos began to dominate the city skyline. I didn't take physical revenge on them. I didn't have to. My success was the most crushing, absolute revenge they could ever witness. Then, the year 2026 arrived, and it was time to show my family the true price of their gold. Back in the dining hall of my estate, the silence is so heavy you can hear the rain tapping outside the window. My grandchildren are staring at the old leather suitcase on the mahogany table. They look shocked, uncomfortable, and deeply humbled. They had never heard this story. To them, I was always just the billionaire grandmother who owned the family trust. "Grandma," my grandson who had laughed earlier says, his voice dropping to a whisper, his head lowered in shame. Did Mr. Harrison really try to hurt you?" I slowly pop the rusted latches of the suitcase. The lid creaks open. Inside, there are no millions of dollars. There are no gold bars. There are just 3 items. The thin, faded cotton dress I wore when I stepped off the boat in 1965. The stub of the pencil I used to study accounting by candlelight. The very first $5 bill Mr. Harrison had thrown at me in the bakery basement. I lift the old cotton dress, holding it up against the glittering crystal light of the chandelier. "I kept these items for 60 years, I say, looking at each of my children and grandchildren. I kept them because I never wanted to forget the smell of the basement. I never wanted to forget what it feels like to be treated like trash by a world that judges you by your exterior." I walk over to my grandson, placing the old raw pencil stub in his soft, manicured hand. "You complain when your luxury car is late," I say softly, touching his shoulder. "Your parents complain when the stock market dips by 2%. You live in a house with 20 rooms. But you forget that the foundation of this entire family was laid by an 18-year-old girl who had nothing but this pencil and a burning refusal to let the world break her spirit. Tears are streaming down my daughter's face. She stands up, walking over to wrap her arms around my fragile shoulders. One by one, my children stand up, surrounding the table, looking at the old suitcase not as a piece of junk, but as the most sacred monument of their heritage. They finally understood. They finally realized that their wealth wasn't built on luck. It was built on a war that their grandmother fought in silence, completely alone in the dark. Theme: emotional ending and moral reflection. Every story has a conclusion, but a legacy never truly dies. As I look at my family gathered around that old leather suitcase, I know that my job is complete. I didn't give them money just so they could live in luxury. I gave them a shield so they would never have to experience the coldness I felt under that Harlem bridge. But wealth without perspective is dangerous. It breeds arrogance. And arrogance is what destroyed Mr. Harrison and the sterling elites of the past. They thought their power was permanent, but they didn't realize that empires built on cruelty always crumble from the inside out. To anyone listening to my voice tonight, if you are standing in a dark basement right now, if people are exploiting your labor, if society is telling you that you don't belong because of your accent, your background, or the color of your skin, do not cry in despair. Do not lose your mind in anger. Pick up your book, grab your pencil, build your mind in the silence of the night, because the people who are trying to bury you right now don't realize that you are not a victim. You are a seed. And when a seed is buried in the dark, it doesn't die. It grows until it tears through the concrete, reaching for the sun. If you enjoy emotional drama stories, subscribe for more. Thank you for listening to this episode of Revenge Episodes. Protect your heritage, stay humble, and remember that the heaviest suitcase is often the one that carries the brightest future.